want to welcome you all back, and I also wanted to, I hadn't said this at the outset, but I want to thank our chair for the next session, which was a big surprise to me. Tanya Sheehan reached out to me via email yesterday and said, hey, I noticed you lost some chairs due to the furlough, can I fill in? And I almost jumped out of my chair in excitement. So thank you. I'm very excited to introduce her. Tanya Sheehan was appointed Associate Professor of Art at Colby College in 2013 after teaching at Rutgers and Columbia University. Her first book, Doctored: The Medicine of Photography in 19th-Century America, published by Penn State Press in 2011, takes a new look at the relationship between photography and medicine in American culture, focusing on Civil War and postbellum Philadelphia. Her next book, Blacks and Whites, Race and Photographic Humor, will examine the prolific references to race in photographic humor from 1839 to the present. Professor Sheehan is the recipient of numerous research fellowships, including most recently ones from the Du Bois Institute at Harvard University and the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, as well as other major research libraries. She holds an MA and a PhD in art history from Brown University. Please welcome Dr. Sheehan.
Thank you, Amelia. What can I say? I love to volunteer. Now I'm sure I'll have a lot of email requests, right? I'm very pleased to introduce our speakers today. Their papers are extraordinary. I had the privilege of reading them on the plane last night. The first speaker is James Smalls, and he's Professor of Art History and Theory at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. His research and publications focus on the intersections of race, gender, and queer sexuality in European art and the visual culture of the Black diaspora. He's the author of Homosexuality in Art from 2003, the Homoerotic Photography of Carl Van Vechten from 2006, and much more. He's currently working on a book about the African dancer and artist model Féral Benga in relation to transatlantic art and culture. Mia Bagneris received her PhD from Harvard University in 2009 and currently teaches at Tulane University. Her scholarship explores race in British and American art and visual culture. She's currently writing a book that has the title Coloring the Caribbean, Agostino Brunius and the Painting of Race in the British West Indies, 1765 to 1800. And finally, Nicholas Miller is a PhD candidate at Northwestern University and currently a predoctoral fellow at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. His dissertation looks at the work of Palmer Hayden, William H. Johnson, Thelma Johnson Street, and Jeff Donaldson. It shows how these artists have used African art to generate new forms of Black representation and diasporic affiliation. So please join me in welcoming James Smalls.
All right. This paper is going to really follow nicely from what Camera was just talking about, because it's really, it follows right along. So in 1923, at the age of 17, Francois Benga left his native Dakar, Senegal, and traveled with his father to Paris. His father, who treated the young Benga badly, worked for the French colonial administration in Senegal and was educated by Catholic missionaries in France. It was while on this trip that Francois decided to run away and found odd jobs to make ends meet. Then in 1925, learning that the Folies Bergère was on the lookout for Black dancers, Benga auditioned and was hired. He then adopted the stage name Féral, which in French means wild or untamed, and within a few years became one of the star attractions of the Parisian music hall scene. From the mid-1920s into the 1930s, Benga was the darling of the international elite dance and performing arts circuit and attracted the attention of some European and American modern artists, the latter of whose depictions are the subject of this talk. Benga's role as a dancer and artist model lays bare the extent to which African and African-American artists have played a central, rather than peripheral role in the formation as well as in the deformation of modernism and primitivism. Just as importantly, Benga's corporeality and its representation by others, I argue, bring not only Africa, but the silence and blindness to the homoerotic into the orbit of primitivism and modern Black Atlantic discourses. In April of 1926, in the review La Folie du Jour, amidst a jungle decor, Benga was one among other Black male dancers who pounded the drums while accompanying Josephine Baker, showcased as the character Fatou, in her infamous banana dance. Shortly thereafter, Benga drew attention to himself when he danced in the review Tout pour Josephine, in which he performed a comedic drag homage to Baker. Not long afterwards, in a popular skit called La Boule de Fleurs, he performed yet another drag parody of Baker. Both reviews were filled with the crudest primitivist stereotypes designed to entertain white colonial fantasies of taboo and desire. In these and other performances, Benga showcased his talents as a highly accomplished dancer known for his physical dexterity, his quote-unquote impish good looks, and carnal choreography. He gained a popular reputation in Paris as the male counterpart to Josephine Baker. From the mid-20s into the 1930s and 40s, Benga appeared in a barrage of on-stage tableaux that included the 1931 Primitivist review called On the Lip of the Negress, in which he starred alongside the electrifying female Malian dancer Melka Soudani. Both African performers were complicit in primitivist excesses of the period. For many Black artists and performers in the United States and abroad, for many of them, primitivism was a distinctive trait associated with Blacks that constituted an auspicious new trend in white thinking. In addition, primitivism's embrace became a symbol of Black investment in modernity. Perhaps most importantly, primitivism generated a market environment in which African and African American art could thrive and be patronized by a receptive audience. But as David Chinitz has pointed out, Black complicity in primitivism could also be a dangerous move, one that, he says, remains a painful and problematic issue. Despite the drawbacks, some Black artists and writers saw a modicum of agency within the primitivist craze, and Benga is counted among these. While Josephine Baker became known as the Ebony Venus, Benga managed to garner his own set of laudatory designations with the critics, who often referred to him as the Black Mercury, the beautiful Negro Adonis, the splendid Black dancer, and the bronze god. Like Baker, Benga performed eroticized, sauvage dances, typically clad in skin-tight, skimpy shorts, or with a revealing loincloth and oiled-up skin. Clearly, Benga's meteoric rise to fame depended on his welcomed comparison and contrast with Baker, whose body became the incarnation of an eroticized primitivism for a primarily heterosexual male audience, and who has been described as, quote, pure theatrical Viagra, end quote. Her fame and notoriety reflected modernism's affinity not only for primitivism, but also for a compulsory heterosexuality assumed within it. Both personalities became a sign of otherness in the context of the Parisian music hall tradition, and both understood and accepted that they were being categorized as representatives of primitivism and negrophilia, fulfilling the exotic and erotic yearnings of spectators. Unlike Baker, however, Benga did not sustain his fame for long. His image was not marketed or mythologized in the same way as had been the case with her. Likewise, he left behind no press interviews regarding his views on his role or impact in Black self-representation vis-a-vis stereotyped imagery. Indeed, it was an uphill battle for Benga to compete with a standard heterosexualizing assumption within the popular craze for primitivism, a movement in which men routinely objectified and sexualized women. However, it is important to note that Benga, like Baker, was not at all a passive victim when it came to exploiting his own body within the popularity of primitivism. As with other black modernists of the period, he willingly participated in the commodification of black culture and black bodies. He actively and knowingly allowed his body to become a site of contemplation and carnal pleasures for whites and blacks, men and women, both of whom universally admired him for his audacious sexual allure and sense of amazing seduction. Those were quotes. I contend that on stage and in the modernist imaginary, Benga's authentic African body, in contrast to Baker's inauthentic one, in that she was an African American and not African, allowed for a wider range of experimentation and manipulation by artists who were keen on combining ideas of classical elegance with primitivist playfulness and erotic fantasy. Such a body was potentially subversive, aesthetically and ideologically, serving as a symbol of boundary dissolution where sexual propriety is concerned, and alternately as a site of critique of culturally imposed definitions of masculinity. In addition to an array of photographs, paintings, and films produced by modern artists of the period, our primary knowledge of Benga's life and historical importance comes to us from two written sources. Geoffrey Gorer's highly successful book, Africa Dances, published in 1935, and a 2004 anecdotal account titled Memories of African and Other Theaters, written by Maurice Sonor Senghor, the nephew of Leopold Senghor and a Benga protege. Gorer, a British anthropologist, made Benga's acquaintance in 1935 and wrote a book that documents a journey that the two men undertook at Benga's invitation through various parts of West Africa that included Senegal, Mali, the Ivory Coast, Benin, and Nigeria. The initial purpose of the trip was to witness firsthand different kinds of African dance and for Benga to recruit a handful of native dancers to form an all-African troupe that would be staged specifically for European and American audiences. And by doing so, Benga hoped to revalorize an authentic African patrimony in Europe and America that would operate subversively within the context of colonialism by destroying the hierarchical structure of Western dance as being superior to African dance. Unfortunately, this dance company never materialized. Benga's popularity in the United States widened when the African-American sculptor Richmond Barthé paid homage to the dancer with the exhibition of his 1935 statue, Féral Benga Dance Figure. With this piece, Barthé brought the sensual allure of Benga's authentic African body into American modernist interest and experience. It was in 1934, while on an extended trip to Europe, that Barthé traveled to Paris and saw Benga perform at a small cabaret restaurant located on the Rue de Tilsit in Paris. Here, the public was introduced to traditional Senegalese cuisine and to various kinds of entertainment that included music and dances from different parts of Africa. Barthé was instantly smitten with Benga. Upon his return to New York in 1935, Barthé immediately began to model the dancer based on a pose that was actually taken from a Wallerie photograph that graced the restaurant's menu, showing Benga performing his popular Danse du Sabre, or Dance of the Saber. Barthé's Parisian sojourn became a pivotal moment in the sculptor's life and career, for his discovery of Benga's African body in motion stimulated a new direction for his art. He resolved to use that body as a conceptual template through which to link his interest in the African diaspora with his own homosexuality and spiritual sensibilities. The statue's compliance with primitivist traits is set in relationship to a male body that is eroticized, spiritually contemplative, and recognizably African. It is important to note that just before modeling his statue, Barthé had read Gorer's book, which had become popular during the period among Anglo and Francophonic negrophiles. Gorer's text was important for Benga in that it provided the sculptor a better understanding of how race and sexuality in African dance forms could dovetail and become operative forces in his sculptures. In his description of movements that supposedly typified Senegalese dance, Gorer had identified two general types, warlike and orgiastic dances. The conflict between violent movement and passive elegance is harmonized in the statue and becomes the basis for the artist's subsequent obsession with dance, ritual, and the evocation of homoerotic desire through black male physique. In addition, Barthé's sculpture conceptually underscores the cross-cultural hybridity of Benga's choreographic choices and his revered dancing style, characterized by very supple and lively gestures borrowed from Western, classical, African, and acrobatic technique. Indeed, Benga was highly accomplished in various forms of African dance and was adept at dancing to djembe rhythms. These are African rhythms associated with West African drumming, and other dances characteristic of the Senegalese ethnic groups of his parents, who were Lebu and Serer. Benga's dance style, bringing together African and European dance forms into a hybrid concoction, was highly admired in the United States. Benga's aesthetic and lived compliance with the precepts and expectations of modernist primitivism was unique in that the combination of an Afrocentric primitivism and a Eurocentric notion of refinement, represented by his body, his dancing, and Barthé's statue, was set in relationship to a marked racial and erotic solicitation that was directed primarily at a male viewership. In this way, Benga subverted from within the construct of modernist primitivism by presenting, promoting, and encouraging others to consume his atypical African body, that is, a body that was male and sexualized, intended to attract both men and women, and that moved spatially in a quasi-African, quasi-European manner. Benga's African body in performance promoted the idea of cultural hybridity as part of modernism's transnational, transcultural, and transerotic cross-currents. The popularity of Benga, the flesh and blood performer, and Barthé's statue must be considered in light of the complexity and ambiguity of primitivism as a concept and popular trend during this period. In the United States, primitivism as a modernist practice dovetailed with Alain Locke's promotion of it to African Americans, a fact that fueled Barthé's interest in depicting Benga. Locke, a lifelong friend and prime supporter of Barthé's work, viewed primitivism as an affirming rather than denigrating notion to be exploited productively by African American artists. Barthe has successfully brought to visual life Locke's ambiguous thoughts on primitivism, embracing it as empowering modernist trend while simultaneously permitting the undercurrents of a Hellenized homoeroticism to percolate to the surface and beg for appreciation from both primitivists and classicists. Féral Benga dance figure successfully underscores Barthé's critical engagement with Africa and by extension creates a productive connection between racial and homoerotic desires through the male nude form in motion. Now, the collusion of some black artists with their white male counterparts in promoting primitivism during this period suggests that its engagement by all interested parties constitutes primitivism's undisputed racial as opposed to strictly racist character. Perhaps no one knew this better than Carl van Vechten, who, to the consternation of many people, both in the past as well as today, figures prominently in the historical development of black art and culture. He was one of many modernists of the period who was positively carried away with the primitivist ardor and seriously involved in its promotion. In January of 1937, Van Vechten welcomed Benga into his New York studio as the subject of a series of photographs in which the dancer was placed in a variety of sensual and campy poses. The series constitutes part of Van Vechten's interest in jokingly signifying on the primitive and the homoerotic. In these, Van Vechten poses Benga with various signature studio props that are intended to capitalize on an assumed dichotomy between the primitive and the classical. In most of these images, Benga is presented shirtless, so to correlate a bodily presence with Africa as exotic, erotic ideal and experience. Van Vechten's portrait of the dancer in a business suit plays upon the hybrid ways in which Benga's body was known to move, signifying on the primitive as unclothed and the civilized as clothed. Van Vechten's take on primitivism is unique, I think, in that these images are based on a tongue-in-cheek camp theatricality that highlight an interchange among the cultural, racial, and homoerotic aspects of primitivism, employed as subversive gesture and idea. His photographic emphasis on primitivist and erotic tropes were intended, I believe, to acknowledge and yet poke fun at his own relationship to black culture and modernist primitivism. In this process of quote-unquote self-critique, he used the camera to confirm his status as a modernist and to document and preserve what he saw as living artifacts of black culture. Through his photographically contrived identification with the homoeroticized and primitivized racial scene, Van Vechten sought to unhinge and disrupt standard codings of sexuality, race, and class expectations within a heterosexually inflected primitivism. As well, he accomplished all this under the well-meaning, albeit for many people misguided, belief in fostering understanding and equality between the races. Around 1934, another white American artist, George Platt Lynes, produced a series of photographs of Benga that bring racialized and homoeroticized desires into the orbit of primitivism and its relationship to surrealism. Although the exact relationship between Benga and Lynes remains murky, the latter did have this to say about the former. So this is Lynes, quote, "Féral Benga, the Dakar dancer, the finest middle-aged physique in the world. Heart-shaped chest, smoothly tapering legs like Josephine Baker's. Round-eyed, the whites of his eyes circularly showing as if in ceaseless apprehension or fury. Nevertheless, a beguiling, worldly personage and good company," end quote, end quote. Although Lynes' images of Benga's body constitute a visual means through which homoeroticism, surrealism, primitivism, and racial alterity could commingle, it should be noted that Lynes never found his comfort zone within the surrealist movement. His focus on Benga, as had been the case with other white modernists such as Pavel Chelychev, constituted a prominent centerpiece within a rarefied universe of gay men who sought to distance themselves from surrealism and primitivism while fostering a closely knit international community of modernists with same-sex interests and desires. It was through Benga's body that they attempted to subvert surrealism and primitivism and to foster an alternative, what I call homo-utopic ideal. Now, in the same year that Gorer's book was published and Barthé's statue was crafted, the African-American artist and art historian James Porter produced an intriguing bust-length portrait believed to be of Benga called Soldat Sénégalais. Now, while on sabbatical from teaching at Howard University, Porter traveled to Paris in the early 1930s where he met many West Africans, including Benga. And instead of depicting Benga as an exotic and erotic dancer, Porter presents him instead as not only older, but as a stationary military figure wearing the khaki-colored uniform and fez of the French colonial troops called tirailleurs sénégalais. Because there is no evidence to suggest that Benga ever served in the French colonial army, although I have come across some images showing Benga in military uniform, so he did serve in the French military, and I'm doing more research on this to find out what he actually did. Anyway, I believe that the painting is, in fact, most likely a fantasy concocted by Porter and based on the painter's fascination with Benga's authentic African origins. And this is actually substantiated by something that Porter wrote in the November 1935 issue of the Crisis magazine, highlighting Benga's fame as a dancer and acknowledging his trip to Africa and his study of native African dances. So from an alternative perspective, however, Porter could here be negatively critiquing or perhaps even denigrating Benga's international status as an erotic and exotic icon. The image is ambiguous in that Benga's body is enveloped in a uniform that serves as a double symbol of upward mobility and colonial oppression. By its very presence, the tirailleur uniform references the nudity or semi-nudity of the Africans who resisted colonial conquest. As well, the wearing of the uniform signified a symbolic means by the colonizer to tame the assumed corps sauvage. Moreover, the figure of the tirailleur constitutes a hybrid character, one who was no longer completely African, but who could no longer be envisioned as completely French either. So as a liminal creature, the tirailleur occupies the interface between the murky world of the colonized and that of the colonizer. Hence, there is a fundamental ambivalence created to his status as well as to his image, both vis-a-vis African societies and the colonial world. Indeed, Benga lived and performed within such an ambiguous sphere. This equivocal position, midway between the colonial universe and that of the colonized, lends itself to the projection of corporeal fantasies of savagery and unbridled sexuality that formed a mirror image in the Western imaginary of the disciplined and socially useful, yet domesticated or assimilated body that could become féral, that is, sauvage at any time. So to conclude, as dancer, muse, and icon of la vogue nègre, Féral Benga was more than a flash-in-the-pan cabaret dancer and artist model. I contend that he was a significant catalyst integral to the fostering and promoting of racial specificity and the homoerotic, combined as meaningful strategy for seizing liberatory agency within modernist and Afro-modernist practice and encounter. His body and its visualization by others helped foster the political and creative expressions and complications of Black modernist consciousness and agency within the vigorous energies and contradictions of modernism and primitivism. Féral Benga endures as a legacy, albeit an admittedly forgotten one. But for me, he remains a captivating role model and a puzzling icon of infinitely dynamic modern possibilities. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Smithsonian American Art Museum and certainly the work of Amelia in organizing this panel. I also need to thank Teresa Leninger Miller, Stephen Nelson, and Alton Obie Jr. for their help in putting together this talk, particularly in communicating with the Museum of African American Art in Los Angeles, and also James Smalls for offering me a wonderful point of entry for my own talk. As I think it is safe to say that Palmer Hayden's African dancer was no Féral Benga. In contrast to the striking grace and shining beauty in Benga's sinuous sinews, captured by Richmond Barthé and others taken with the modern African muse, Hayden's dancer is no exemplar of the exotic erotic and embodies more colonial cacophony than colonial fantasy. At the center of the work, the dancer struts his, obviously a somewhat complicated pronoun here, stuff across the page. With its backdrop of mud-molded architecture, two palm trees rising in the left-hand margin, the scene may be primitive, But his dance is more silly than sauvage. Feet forward, face profiled in the opposite direction, body twisted in a three-quarter attitude with palms pushing outward, the contorted mess of angles that comprise the performer's body should conform to the primitive modern expectation for an African dancer. But the effect is all wrong. Hayden fails to infuse the pose with the dynamic energy or confounding grace for which Parisians praised Josephine Baker. The angles are somehow subtle and sloppy rather than sharp and elegant, and the understated edge of danger that goes with le primitif, exercised by the soft roundness of the dancer's flaccid paunch and the exaggerated ridiculousness of his minstrel face. He is all gender confused, with none of the powerful, if pretty, masculinity of Benga. Skinny legs with no muscle definition emerge from beneath the billows of a soft skirt, giving way to his flabby belly, echoing the spiked mounds of the architecture behind. The pointy peaks of prosthetic breast cones suspended from a necklace of sharp talon-like forms project from the dancer's body, threatening to pierce the very paper upon which they are painted. But really, who can take a threat seriously from a face like that? Despite the profile rendering, there is no mistaking the wide grin made by the fat lips that finish his elongated jawline. The enthusiasm of his smile reduces his eyes to squinting slits. Though there seems to be no need to exaggerate the performer's absurdity, Hayden completes the look with a hoop earring and a preposterous little cap, effectively transforming the dancer into an organ grinder monkey. In a period when Black artists like Aaron Douglas depicted African dancers as idealized, if homogenized, icons of a glorious African past, what is the viewer to make of Hayden's smiling simian? How do we imagine Hayden's answer to the interrogative refrain that echoes through County Cullen's now canonical 1925 poem Heritage, Spice Grove, Cinnamon Tree? What is Africa to me? What was it for Palmer Hayden? While the Harlem Renaissance is popularly regarded as a moment when many Black Americans first embraced their African heritage as a cultural legacy worthy of celebration, Cullen's query underscores the degree of ambivalent tension, somewhat less well recognized, that many Black writers and artists felt regarding their connection to the so-called motherland. In his watershed 1925 essay, The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, Alain Locke encouraged Black artists to look to traditional arts of Africa as a rich archive of visual material, fine examples of, and I quote, discipline, of style, of technical control pushed to the limits of technical mastery, that could serve as a profound and galvanizing influence in developing a distinctly African-American modern art. New Negro artists, interpreting the text as a mandate to embrace their African ancestral legacy, studied African art and incorporated the influence of African sculpture, motifs, and themes into their modern compositions. Though they might have arrived at different conclusions regarding how to engage the legacy of Africa in their work, most Black artists of the period did at least significantly wrestle with the question of what Africa meant to them. And here are just a few examples, and some of these predate Locke's essay, for example, Meta Fuller's slightly earlier Ethiopia, which was conceived of as early as 1914, though not executed until 1921. For the most part, however, Palmer Hayden was not one of these artists hung up on Africa. A familiar face on the Harlem Renaissance scene in New York, who also moved among New Negro luminary circles during his 5-year tenure in Paris, Hayden stands as an outlier among his New Negro peers for his professed lack of interest in anything that Africa might have had to offer him by way of cultural kinship, artistic inspiration, or aesthetic legacy. Remembering the New Negro period during an interview with Harry Henderson some 40 years later, the artist famously quipped, "I never had any desire to paint anything about Africa. I painted what Negroes, colored people, us Americans do. We're a brand new race, raised and manufactured in the US." And for the most part, Hayden's oeuvre confirms this. In addition to demonstrating a lifelong, and for the archival researcher, mind-numbing fascination with boats, boats and more boats, his work generally depicts the daily doings of Black Americans, rural Blacks like those he grew up with in Widewater, Virginia, or urban dwellers like his fellow Harlemites. While Hayden clearly would have disagreed with George Schuyler about the impossibility of Negro art made in America, that this art should have its thematic basis in Africa or aesthetic foundation in African art, he would have concurred was indeed hokum. This did not mean, however, that Hayden never engaged with Africa or with the new Negro intelligentsia's ideas about Africa's importance. Indeed, perhaps his most well-known work, Fétiches Fleurs, incorporates both the head of a Féral reliquary and a Cuba textile. Understanding the work as a sincere and straightforward interpretation of Locke's call, beginning in the mid-1970s, several important African-American art scholars dated the painting to 1926, a year after the first publication of Locke's legacy essay. However, no record of the painting exists before around 1933, when it made its public debut at the Harman Foundation exhibition and won the gold medal for painting. As curator Alan M. Gordon notes in the catalog for his 1988 exhibition of Hayden's work at the Museum of African American Art in Los Angeles, considering that Hayden's numerous sketchbooks show no indication of Hayden's working in an African vein during the mid-20s, that he did not show the work among the numerous marine scenes on display at his first solo show at Harlem Civic Club in 1926, and that no evidence of the work exists before the early 30s, accepting this earlier date related to Locke's essay for the work is a problematic endeavor. Moreover, recent scholars such as Sharon Patton and John Ott point out that the painting can easily be understood as a subtle jab at Locke and his fellows, rather than an earnest interpretation of his ideas. Where Locke hoped Black artists would employ the inspiration of African art to produce art that was fresh, vital, and modern, Hayden composes a decidedly academic composition in which the reliquary and the cloth might simply stand in for a neoclassical figure or a crocheted doily in a traditional parlor picture. Thus, Hayden subtly critiques both the superficial nature of the new Negro appreciation for African art and, in the work's pretentious French title, the European-mediated mechanisms through which this appreciation had come to be. You can see he was fond of cartoons and poking fun at sort of this affected Frenchiness. While other scholars have given passing attention to the jab at Locke and his followers that Fétiches Fleurs perhaps comprises, little consideration has been given to Hayden's three other works featuring African content, a suite of watercolor sketches of African dancers made around the same time, of which African Dancer, the first slide I showed you, is one. Writing in the catalog for the Hayden show at Mala, Alan Gordon hailed Fétiches Fleurs as, and I quote, one of Hayden's outstanding works, a cultural signifier with the capacity to excite and objectify a response as it elusively and episodically refers to Africa. He also noted, rather vaguely I'd argue, that the painting operates on a whole different level, this is also a quote, than either African Dancer or African Dancers. Two works which receive no further attention. Gordon leaves it at that and does not elucidate what characterizes this whole different level upon which Fétiches Fleurs works, though it's certainly implied that this level is a better one. The statement simply appears over a black and white inset image of African Dancer, as if to suggest that the work's deficiencies should be self-evident. The image speaks for itself, no further explanation necessary. This undoubtedly has much to do with Hayden's controversial portrayal of Black physiognomy evident in these works, as well as a number of others, most famously The Janitor Who Paints, which Hayden repainted in order to get rid of some of the more objectionable representations, and A Midsummer Night's Dream in Harlem. These types of depictions led James Porter to describe Hayden as, and I quote him, a talent gone far astray, whose application of humor is ill-advised, if not altogether tasteless, and to compare his works to, again a quote, those ludicrous billboards that were plastered on public buildings to advertise the black-faced minstrels. While more forgiving scholars than Porter saw in these images of Hayden painting his own people a deliberate naivete, painting the familiar with a sort of folksy charm, the application of exaggeration seems less easy to forgive and more difficult to interpret in images of the so-called primitive other, especially given Hayden's professed lack of interest in Africa. While I agree with Gordon that Hayden's African Dancers series operates on a whole different level than Fétiche et Fleurs, I assert that this stems not from some deficiency in the images themselves, though admittedly they are not my favorite things to look at, but in the fact that they are far more ambiguous, complicated, and difficult to interpret than they at first appear. In Hayden's African Dancers, and you can see he was terribly creative with the titles here, a central figure leads a party of two other performers, all three grooving to the heady beat provided by two drummers who anchor the lower left-hand corner. The two trailing dancers follow behind, one masked, the other generally faceless, and the three figures form a train, their bodies overlapping so that they move as one entity. As in the watercolor of the lone performer that opened my talk, the central figure is fabulously outfitted in an ensemble whose gender ambiguity makes the assignment of pronouns here somewhat questionable. Thick, muscular thighs, created by Hayden's skillful use of variation in hue, protrude from beneath a fluffy skirt of lavender fringe. Presented in profile, the exaggerated physiognomy of his face includes outsized lips, a broad, flat nose, and a large, high forehead. Hayden's highlighting and selective use of pigment exaggerates the character of these features, particularly in the pronounced lips left white. The dancer leans into the movement, body poised on the diagonal with his bum thrust outward, pushing into the masked figure who follows closely behind him. So close, in fact, that the masked figure appears almost to mount him, and it is hard to discern a separation between them beyond the transition in hue from lavender fringe to banana yellow. All three dance on the balls of their feet, a curvilinear swath of sheer purple delineating the arc of an untenable path that seems inevitably destined for collision with the musicians who sit on the ground of the left-hand page. And I've had to leave out of the talk in the interest of time a little bit about the construction and composition of this and how I feel it talks about the constructiveness of what I'll talk about later, but if somebody wants to ask a question about that, feel free. So what prompted Hayden, an artist who by his own admission never had any desire to paint anything about Africa, to make an image like this one, indeed to undertake 4 African-themed works in the period between 1931 and 1932? I concur with Teresa Lininger Miller, who asserts that Hayden must have been influenced by the monumental colonial exhibition held from May to November at the Bois de Vincennes during the last year of Hayden's 5-year stint in Paris. Taking this observation a step further, however, I'd like to assert that Hayden's images of African dancers, in keeping with the subtle but biting humor of the cartoons he drew throughout his Paris sojourn and indeed throughout his career, comment upon the artificiality and performative nature of the colonial exhibition itself, likening the event to a great colonialist circus or modern minstrel show. Moreover, in keeping with Hayden's insistence that he never had any desire to paint anything about Africa, I argue that they have less to do with Africa or Africans and more to do with the contrived performance of otherness and the concomitant construction of modern French national identity that he witnessed at the Grand Parisian Colonial Fair. It's hard to exaggerate the awesome spectacle of the International Colonial Exhibition, which fellow New Negro artist Elizabeth Prophet hailed as, and I quote, the most spectacular colonial extravaganza ever staged in the West. While several other nations, including the US, participated in the event, France outshone them all, staging a reproduction of its empire on the grounds of the Bois de Vincennes by importing roughly 1,500 indigènes from across la plus grande France to live and work in grandly scaled replicas of their native architecture, including a nearly full-scale model of Angkor Wat. Over the course of roughly 6 months, more than 33 million visitors from across the globe descended upon the colonial fair to visit the display of empire in not-so-miniature, for which the state also constructed a permanent colonial museum and issued a series of postage stamps. Hayden certainly attended the grand event. In an interview decades later, he recalled seeing the drummers and dancers there, and indeed, the event made enough of an impression upon him that he was inspired to write the office of the International Colonial Exposition's U.S. Commission with his thoughts about it. Sadly, we don't have the other half of this correspondence to know precisely what were Hayden's amiable pensées, but apparently he felt no compulsion to visually document the event. His extant sketchbooks from the period contain no records of the sights he saw there, just, for the most part, boats, boats, and more boats. Moreover, despite the fact that watercolor, with its ability to suggest a hastily captured fleeting moment in time, offered the perfect medium to suggest an ethnographically informed eyewitness impression, it's difficult to attribute any sort of documentary impulse, actual or feigned, to the execution of Hayden's depiction of the African performers, which were created several months to a year after the fact. The artist-cartoonist stylized performers read very differently, for example, from the reportage style, which with Henry Schaeffer captured a similar group of dancers in the July 1931 special issue of L'Illustration devoted to the colonial exhibition. Both images feature a trio of dancers in fiber skirts and breast shields, one with a horned mask, accompanied by percussionists in white tunics. And Hayden's dancers do have a decidedly Dogon-esque flair. However, where Schaeffer aims to infuse his image with a documentary quality that conveys a sense of authenticity, a sense of being rendered on the spot, to deliver the viewer the reality of the tam-tam de Bandiagara, Hayden exploits the medium and some of the devices of documentary illustration to convey the artificial performance of reality. He aims not to produce a sense of truth, but to critique the colonial exposition's production of, to borrow Colbert's very precise term, truthiness, in its C'était indigène. In other words, Hayden's interest here is in the performativity of the scene that he had witnessed previously, of the dancers' performance of Africanness for the visitors of the fair, not so much in capturing the performance, but the performing. Hayden's watercolors, no linear silhouettes that render them, like Aaron Douglas's work, shadows of an imagined Pan-African past, have a gestural quality, an immediacy, and a cartoonish humor that pulls them into the present tense. And the aesthetic choices that he made in rendering the African figures are arguably more informed by the sights that the artist imbibed during his half-decade in Paris, particularly images like Paul Collin's iconic depictions of Josephine Baker and the other images of Jazz-age Paris from the 1927 Folio Le Témoin Noir, than they have any sort of sincere interest in Africa or Africans. It seems to me that despite the obvious differences of intention and agency on the part of the objectified performers, certainly you can't put sort of the performers in the colonial fair in the same on the same plane in terms of their intentions and agency as Josephine Baker or even Féral Benga, Hayden recognized a kinship in Baker's playing the savage for French audiences and the performance of otherness by colonial Africans that reinforced French ideas of their own identity at the colonial fair. Putting on a show was something that Hayden understood, having spent his early 20s working as a roustabout for Ringling Brothers Circus. Hayden reported that he'd made a pretty penny there, producing publicity graphics for the show after drawings that he had made of circus kinkers had been noticed by his bosses. Lininger Miller attributes what she calls Hayden's, and I quote, lifelong signature carnival-like style to this early experience, and Hayden's African dancers clearly are more circus clowns than the exotic ethnographic specimens that the organizers of the colonial exposition aimed to present. While we cannot deny that internalized racism may have had some influence in Hayden's portrayal of Black physiognomy, that he lovingly portrayed his own people in the same manner suggests that the outlandish outfits and exaggerated features of Hayden's dancers are less about denigrating Africans and more about Hayden's effort to call a spade, or in this case, a minstrel show when it came to the colonial exhibition. While organizers of the event clearly aimed to bring a little piece of l'Afrique to the Bois de Vincennes, for Hayden, the exotic temples and villages they erected as examples of native architecture were no different than a circus tent. And of course, for an American like Hayden, who, in the artist's own words, was raised and manufactured in the US, a black-faced clown was nothing but a minstrel, the inverse of the elegantly dressed white-faced clown blanc of the French tradition, hence the caricatured faces to which James Porter so vigorously objected. Of course, great minstrel performers like Bert Williams and, it could be argued, Josephine Baker, who is seen here reigning rather problematically as the queen of the colonies at the colonial exhibition, despite the fact that she was an American, their sorts of performances suggest the fraught nature of such routines, especially for blacks performing blackness for whites. Hayden, I believe, recognized such complicated dynamics at the colonial exhibition and attempted to respond to them, perhaps not completely successfully, in these watercolor works. Around the same time that the artist painted his African dancers, he completed another watercolor, a sensitively rendered self-portrait. Quiet, intimate, subtle, it stands in stark contrast to his African performers. Yet putting it next to African dancer, there is something familiar in the gender ambiguity of Hayden's flabby paunch, the rounded suggestion of a breast below the right arm of his slender, penisless body. One wonders whether Hayden, who arguably caught up in his own modern minstrel show in playing a sort of trained monkey for the Harmon Foundation, though as John Ott has persuasively argued, certainly not in any way that he didn't fully understand and subtly acknowledge, one wonders whether he recognized a similarity between himself and these dancers. But I think he'd agree that whatever kinship they shared, it had less to do with Africa, whether in America or France, the modern minstrel show of performing blacks for whites.
Hello, everyone. Oh, wow. Call and response, I like it. Thank you again to all the institutions that went into making today possible. To Amelia, thank you for your heroic efforts. And to all of you for being here for this final presentation of the day. In 1939, William H. Johnson painted what was perhaps his most profound avant-garde gambit, a black nude reclining in the pose of an odalisque. Equal parts Manet's Olympia, Gauguin's Tehomana, and Matisse's unnamed blue nude of Biskra, Johnson cites the aforementioned masters only to stake claim to and advance their modernist tradition. A viewer is implied through the figure's outward gaze and Johnson's inclusion of a table in the center foreground, the phallic wine bottle serving as a not-so-subtle Peircean designation of the flesh that is on view. However, such interpolating signs do not easily allow one to enter the painting. Following its forebears, the painting has an incredibly shallow depth of field. The broad swath of white that marks the plane of the bed is tilted impossibly upward with a colorfully striped bedspread paralleling the mattress's profound verticality. The pillow on which the figure rests her head further disrupts any semblance of perspectival congruity, as it is likewise forcefully flattened against the surface of the canvas. A basket of flowers accompany the figure. They are not presented to her through the aid of a raced attendant, but rather as a floating presence, unmoored from the pedestal just behind them in the upper right corner of the canvas. Finally, the figure itself has an undeniable materiality, as she is painted in deep brown hues with thick applications of paint and outlined in deep black contours. Her languid pose, an inverse of blue nude, but with a similar axial rotation along the hip, is neither invitation nor direct confrontation. Similar to her art historical precedences, she maintains an ambiguous countenance. The painting as a whole is simultaneously enticing and illicit, as form and content are married to invite the viewer in, but keep the gaze at bay. Johnson's stated objective at the time of his return to the United States in 1938 was, quote, to paint his own people, end quote, and Nude is but an early foray into this mission. Coinciding with such in-studio portraits, Johnson also employed this mode of figuration to document scenes of the urban North, as in street life Harlem, and the rural South, as in early morning work. By shuttling between these divergent locations, Johnson captured the geographies most readily associated with the African-American experience with the Great Migration, even if the images themselves were produced in the artist's Harlem studio. It is not difficult to imagine how these sites informed Johnson's conception of a community as he was born in Florence, South Carolina, and lived for many years in New York City. Yet alongside these American-based geographies, Johnson also painted a handful of Orientalist depictions of the black body, perhaps loose interpretations of his own sojourn to North Africa, that are cause for pause in determining the precise contours of the community he designated as his people. In a discrepant fashion, inconsistent with his scenes documenting the North or the South, yet rhyming with the content of Nude, paintings such as Three Dancers and Breakfast for Madame advance eroticized images of the black body, now costumed with Orientalist signifiers and drawing upon Orientalist tropes. This paper, then, is an attempt to grapple with Johnson's own particular avant-garde gambits and their manifestations in his depictions of the African-American and Orientalized black body. After first describing the development of Johnson's new stylistic idiom, specifically its relationship to African sculpture and self-taught artistic practices, I turned to the artist's North African paintings. Although Johnson had firsthand experience living in North Africa, and according to his own accounts, was even mistaken as being North African while visiting Tunisia, his portrayals of an imagined North African body revivify and expand well-worn modernist tropes that center on the sexualization of the black body. In doing so, I suggest that Johnson advanced an uneven set of relations between African American and North African identities. These works, I will argue, reveal the often ambivalent workings of African American painterly practices that attempt to channel an African heritage and reveal the misapprehensions that occur within the process of generating intradiasporic relations through modernist artistic practice. It is neither incidental nor coincidental that Johnson produced Nude in 1938. He returned to Harlem only 1 year earlier after a roughly 12-year absence from the United States. During that time, he and his wife, fellow artist Holke Craig, had lived and traveled throughout France, Germany, Denmark, and Norway, while also sojourning to Tunisia for a 3-month visit. Upon his return to the United States, he would transition from an expressionist-inflected and color-saturated mode of landscape painting, as seen in Mountain Blossom's Volda, to a highly idiosyncratic and primitivistic language of figuration, of which Nude is a prime example. While his sense of color and his thick impasto handling of paint would remain key attributes to his practice, his attention now turned to the full figure, which he painted in a style equally informed by his encounters with African art and a contemporary discourse of so-called primitive, folk, or self-trained artists. Johnson had viewed African art in Europe, but it seems as if his interest in its formal features truly manifested in the United States. In a series of drawings, most likely executed at the Harlem Community Art Center where he taught, Johnson translated African sculptural forms from photographs reproduced in the Museum of Modern Art's catalog for their exhibition, African Negro Art, to paper. Compiling over 600 objects from notable collections throughout the world, curator James Johnson Sweeney's aim was to display African art in a manner that showcased the objects for their artistic rather than ethnographic value. The photographs reproduced in the exhibition catalog mimic the same attention to the aesthetic merits of each object. Contributed by the sculpture's owners, the photographs were all primarily taken from severe frontal, rear, and profile views. As such, the photographs attempt to provide access to the most extreme details of the objects. Generally true to their original sculpture form, Johnson's sketches do include some modifications. For instance, in his translation of a Dogon ancestral figure, the artist captures a basic schematic rendering of the form, but abstracts the facial configuration, using one singular line to bisect the head and signify both the ridge of hair on top as well as the bridge of the nose. He reduces the three-dimensionality of the sculpture's breasts to flattened surfaces on the chest, differentiated from the body through only two slight contours. In Johnson's handling, the figure's protruding navel is signified through the absence in the center of the sculptural form, where the paper's ground is utilized, seemingly antithetically, to indicate projection. Finally, the artist merely gestures to the chevron pattern in the figure's chest with fleeting angular lines. He unites the hands, which were originally separated, and he removes the base of the sculpture altogether. Initially appearing as an autonomous studies, Johnson would subsequently model select figures in his compositions off of such sculptures. Residences of the Dogon form appear in the first iteration of the painting Street Life Harlem, where he drew upon the sketch and the photograph to model the female figure on the left. As in the drawing, the position of the hands are adjusted, this time with the artist raising the figure's right hand to a resting position on the left wrist. The line used to bisect the head is now used to model the nose and bring it into fuller relief, and the stylized pattern of the lips seem to harken back to the original sculpture. Moreover, the influence of the sculpture is seen in Johnson's reduction of the corporeal form to the slim, abstracted appearance of both the woman and the dapperly dressed man as they stand in this pastel-hued cityscape. In the final iteration of this painting, Johnson added additional color and contour to both figures, especially the female form, lending them a more naturalistic corporeality. Johnson's use of African sculpture can only go so far, however, in explaining his new modernist language. Already by 1938, African art seemed to lose its prominent position as muse for American-trained artists, ceding to a new source of originality in vernacular and self-taught artistic practices. Primarily responsible for the cultivation of this new field of study was Federal Arts Project Director and temporary Director of Exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art, Holger Cahill. In a series of exhibitions beginning in 1930 and continuing through 1939, Cahill argued that the documentation and exhibition of US-based vernacular practices were of central importance to the continuation of the production and appreciation of American art. A certain romantic primitivism undergirded Cahill's discursive framing of such artistic practices. For instance, he saw the increasing mechanization of everyday life inherent to industrial development as an impediment to the cultivation of creativity in the US, and he possessed that great avant-garde desire to do away with the aesthetics of the academy, which he believed to be, quote, anemic and Philistine, end quote. In Cahill's estimation, folk and vernacular art provided the art world with a new optic, one which offered an immediacy of expression, an alternative mode of representing and experiencing the real world. The enthusiasm for such work is partly responsible for the emergence of African-American artists such as William Edmondson and Horace Pippin, who were both, quote-unquote, discovered in the late 1930s and exhibited throughout New York City, Edmondson at the Museum of Modern Art and Pippin at Edith Halpert's Downtown Gallery. Johnson, according to some critics, fits squarely within this tradition, whether situating his work under the guise of the, quote, primitive trend, end quote, in American art, or attributing his style to the, quote, influence of African primitives, end quote, or the, quote, naivety of the Negro, end quote. Reviewers identified something inherently self-taught and primitivist in his new artistic language. Street Life Harlem's awkward perspectival orientation, its lack of modeling, and the crudely contoured bodies and buildings could all be taken as signs of Johnson's cultivation of a folk-like aesthetic. Indeed, starting in the early 1930s while living abroad, Johnson actively courted such readings. In his most elaborate meditation on primitivism, Johnson uses the term to at once describe the working-class fisherman of a Danish village, his own self-identification as a primitive man, and his inherited racial tradition of rhythm and spirituality in the arts. Yet outside of these social biological designations, Johnson also uses the term to describe an aesthetic practice. In the same interview, he states, quote, "But as you know, it is true about art that as soon as it has reached a certain stage, it will return to the primitive, and what it has secured is used to advance again, and then one day once more revert to the primitive. And this, I believe, it will always be in the field of art," end quote. This is a savvy statement to make in 1937, and it helps to explain Johnson's shifts in both style and content after his return to the United States. In works such as Street Life Harlem and Nude, Johnson could be seen to be constructing a theory of African cultural continuity predicated on form, where his, quote, family of primitiveness and tradition, end quote, as he called it, seemingly provided him with an inherent sense of African design. At that time, anthropologist Melville Herskovits, linguist Lorenzo Dow Turner, and the authors associated with the Georgia Writers Project were all looking for precisely such retentions of an African cultural past in the American South. But while Herskovits, Turner, and the Georgia Writers Project were looking for scientifically verifiable cultural continuities, Johnson's work displays an active diasporic cultural construction. This is a no less suitable means to forge diasporic affiliations, but it relies upon the deracination, circulation, and eventual appropriation of diasporic objects, such as African sculpture, infusing the aesthetics of the folk with African sculpture, and performing the role of a primitive artist. Johnson obscures such processes and masks the same modernist cycle of primitivist appropriation and aesthetic reinvigoration that he once diagnosed. In constructing the stylistic idiom through the translation of African artifacts, Johnson opens his practice up to the potential misapprehensions that can occur in African diasporic cultural dialogue. In his study of the early 20th century Black transnationalism, the practices of diaspora, literature, translation, and the rise of Black internationalism, Brent Edwards offers an approach to diaspora that is attuned to the contingencies that arise within African diaspora cultural dialogues, and raises awareness of the, quote, unavoidable misapprehensions and misreadings, end quote, that arise in encounters between people and objects of diasporic descent. Johnson would have had such encounters when he and his wife visited North Africa in 1932. While there, he made a series of watercolor paintings capturing his new environment. Not only did he document the surrounding architecture, but he also painted a handful of figure studies of Tunisian women. Aesthetically, these works appear to be quite conservative, as they seem to serve a more documentary function rather than engage in formal experimentation. However, in the early 1940s, Johnson would revisit an imaginary North Africa when he painted two works, Breakfast for Madame and Three Dancers, which problematize any performance of or claim to an inherited aesthetic relation to Africa. As in Nude, both of the paintings provide full access to the female body, but they are now figured in relationship to Orientalist signifiers, the golden and bejeweled wrist and ankle bracelets, the textiles that accompany the figures in Three Dancers, and the hookah situated in the lower right corner of Breakfast for Madame. In these works, Johnson deploys his recently developed primitivist style and integrates a generic approach to African sculpture through the figure's hyperbolic anatomy, the attenuated arms, protuberant breasts and buttocks, heightened attention to reproductive anatomy, as well as the figure's enlarged feet. Moreover, the painting's almost naive simplicity of expression match their own sophisticated spatial deformations. For instance, the foreground of Three Dancers serves as a virtual proscenium for the promised performance to come, but the women themselves appear untethered to the ground, floating just above the floorboards. This, combined with the fact that none of the figures actually hold the textile behind them, raises the possibility that the viewer is meant to see them as lying down in the pose of an odalisque, rather than an upright posture. They possess an ambivalent orientation in relationship to the horizontal and vertical axis that the surrounding room would suggest. This is especially true of the middle figure, her yellow diamond-patterned textile serving more as a bedsheet than as a shawl, as gravity could only secure the position of the cloth around her waist if she was in a horizontal posture. In Breakfast for Madame, the confluence of striated patterns at the base of the canvas meet the bichromatic blue and beige of the walls with such harsh verticality that no depth is implied at all. Given the position of the kneeling attendant, one could imagine her as resting slightly behind the primary figure, but the platter and transparent bowl of fruit is pushed forward to almost rest atop of the Madame's head. Finally, two rectangles mark what might be a back wall, one perhaps a door, and the other featuring an inset and crudely rendered palm tree, a gesture to some exotic locality that is so flat it is unclear if it is window or poster affixed to the wall. In her now canonical essay on Orientalism, The Imaginary Orient, Linda Nochlin identifies two key ideological tenets of 19th century Orientalist painting, specifically that of Gérôme. First, its privileging of masculine artistic power over female representations, and relatedly, its privileging of the white European colonialist gaze over the non-Western body. According to Nochlin, a work like the Harem Bath naturalizes these ideological constructs as it presents a myth of North Africa through its hyper-realist aesthetic, a stylistic choice that is both highly descriptive and seemingly objective. In the Harem Bath, the body of the seated woman is presented, unabated to the viewer, as it advances an idea of the North African harem as a site of leisure, idleness, and sexual availability. Clearly, Johnson's work Johnson's works do not possess the same degree of representational veracity, but this does not immediately eliminate the possibility that it takes part in Orientalism's politics. Art historian Roger Benjamin has identified a modernist Orientalism in Matisse's Moroccan paintings, such as Zora on the Terrace, that moves away from Gérôme's anecdotal realism and instead uses the language of abstraction to mask troubling subject matter. In both Nochlin and Benjamin's accounts, the artist creating Orientalist works is implicitly white, and both provide deft analyses of the centrality of colonialism to the production of Orientalist images, modernist or not. But while the social hierarchies embedded in either Gérôme or Matisse's work emerge from their cultural position as members of a colonizing nation, I would suggest that Johnson's work provides an asymmetrical relation of power within intradiasporic rather than colonial relationality. Here, the gaze of the black male artist equally participates in gendered scopic violence that reduces the imagined North African female body to a sexualized object. It is tempting to praise Johnson for bringing the black female body into representation and counteracting any claims to the black nude's aesthetic unworthiness, but the images do not do enough to counteract the violent designations that have historically accrued to the black female form, what Judith Wilson calls the, quote, legends, end quote, and Hortense Spillers names the, quote, signifying property plus, end quote, of the black female body. Additionally, through these images, Johnson crafts his own ideological meanings of North Africa, whereas the figure's sartorial expressivity in street life Harlem, to say nothing of their urban surroundings, could be regarded as signifiers that render them contemporaneous with the moment they were painted. The bodies in Johnson's Orientalist compositions are largely atemporal. The absence of history is present in the work's complete lack of geographical exactitude and the erasure of any signs of either modernity or coloniality that would ground the figures in the present. This, quote, denial of coevalness, end quote, as Johannes Fabian would call it, further reinscribes a hierarchy between the artist and the populations on view. Johnson's work, then, presents a much more contested terrain of African diasporic representation. In crafting an aesthetic modeled on African art, and doing so through a self-taught style, Johnson could be viewed as generating an African diasporic art and affiliating himself with the broader diasporic world through form, even if such affiliation necessitated the painterly performance of an African retention-based aesthetic. But form and content do not neatly align. Indeed, they are held in an ambivalent tension. In turning to the North African body, Johnson reproduces a version of the violence embedded within his Orientalist and modernist predecessors by exoticizing the African body and denying it a contemporaneous position in the world. Africa, the problematic and multifarious signifier of diasporic affiliation, becomes nothing but the object of experimentation, to cite Mbembe's apt phrase. This is precisely what makes Johnson's project, beginning in 1938, an African-American primitivist one. It relies upon the construction of an African diasporic heritage through the translation of African forms. It does so through an innovative modernist language, but it also displays an ambivalence as to what the precise contours of the diasporic world may be and what populations of the diaspora one might want to affiliate themselves with. For Johnson, the cultivation of an art portraying his people turns out to be a much more fraught endeavor, exposing the ruptures just as much as the linkages that bind the African diasporic world together. Thank you.
I'd like to invite all of the speakers to come up to the table for questions. And I'm going to offer the briefest of commentaries, probably last 20 seconds, because I think all of these papers speak beautifully to one another. All three take up a position that James Smalls articulated quite well. He said that African American artists played a central role in the modernist discourse of primitivism, and more than that, they deployed that discourse as a critical strategy, one that all three papers show us was full of complexity, and as Nick said, ambivalence. I love the fact that we had three art historians here talking about dance as a medium of cross-cultural communication and specifically diasporic affiliation. I'd love to hear some more from Nick about how William H. Johnson is using dance as a formal strategy. And finally, I love the fact that the first two papers provided the audience with some opportunities to laugh. because they reminded us of the important role of play and humor in serious political expression and artistic experimentation. So I'd like to open it up to the audience, and Amelia has the mic, so just speak into that. We can't see you well. In the very back, yeah.
Hi, thanks. My name is Lee Rayford. I teach at UC Berkeley, and so I also apologize because I'm a little jet-lagged. This isn't totally coherent, but I also want to echo Tanya's sentiments that this was a great panel, that really the papers really just worked together so wonderfully. And I like the way you draw attention to those tensions between being, a modern subject and a primitive object, and these desires for belonging, and these kinds of not just mistranslations, but refusals and disarticulations of diaspora. And it seems to me that what you're also doing is kind of suggesting a different kind of reading practice and a different kind of method to a certain extent. And maybe that's part of kind of drawing on dance. But I guess I actually want you to talk, if you could each say maybe a little bit about your methodology and the way you went about your topics and sort of drawing these connections.
Well, my interest in Féral Benga is actually ongoing because he's very mysterious. And so I look at it as almost like an archaeologist sort of trying to find more information and also discovering those linkages between him and other artists, whether they're black or they're white or whatever they are. And I actually don't have a particular methodology, but usually, well, I guess I do. Gossip. When I read things and someone says something about something that sounds very, flighty and gossipy, that's usually, I go there. And then I find a lot of things, and I think it eventually results in some facts, right? So it's piecing together these disjunctures and these histories that I find very, very interesting. And it's there's no clear-cut methodology to it. It's sort of trying to immerse myself in everything that I can and taking every lead that I can and finding, what I can. But gossip is the key, I think.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a ton of insight to add to the question of methodology. This is very far afield from what I usually work on, which is 18th and 19th century images. But in all of the work that I think I'm interested in talking about, I always veer toward the idiosyncratic. And I actually started my interest in Hayden with the final image that I showed you, the nude self-portrait, where he paints himself without a penis. I saw that work in graduate school and immediately knew that that was the one that I wanted to write about. And as I, looked more and more at Hayden's oeuvre and Hayden himself as a sort of idiosyncratic sort of member of this new Negro club, the African works also spoke to me. And I think that looking at the thing that doesn't seem to fit often provides insight into sort of the larger picture. And so that's typically with all the work that I do kind of what I'm trying to do, looking at that thing that maybe hasn't gotten attention or that doesn't seem to quite fit the mold and using that as a way to look at the broader picture.
And for me, I think I will continue to kind of skirt the issue of methodology a little bit, but to at least say that I'm very interested in modernist painting, although trained primarily within African American studies. And I think primitivism emerged for me as this great and problematic and fraught history that I think once you delve deeper can really show African American and African diasporic artists kind of discrepant engagements with modernism, but also allows you to tell a different tale about how the differential conditions of modernity might affect a black artistic practice. So rather than to hold these artists to the standard criteria of modernist art criticism, but to see different tropes, different trends that emerge in their work. For me, it's been very much related to this kind of notion of the sculptural translation onto the body, and that's one of this kind of episteme which I'm trying to trace in my project right now that goes, actually I start with Palmer Hayden, so I have a nice affinity with him. Palmer Hayden to the 1970s with someone like Jeff Donaldson. And so kind of telling the story of these alternative modernist trajectories that should be just as much, or rather part and parcel of histories of modernism, I guess would be my aspiration.
I got the mic. Yeah, let me also say fantastic panel and really excellent papers all day today. So I have a question for all three of you. Ask you to think about audience. This might be hardest for Mia to do because I don't really know how those images would have circulated at all. But thinking about how contemporaries are responding to the different figures you're looking at, does that help us understand to what extent we see a successful renegotiation of primitivism or complicity with it? I mean, it is sort of the critique through primitivism taking with audiences, whether of dance or the paintings of Johnston. Do we see a recalibration of tactics by the artists when criticism maybe doesn't go in the direction they want it to? So do you have a sense of responses to the works you've been talking about?
Kind of. I think I might be able to say something. I mean, Johnson was taken up as a primitive artist. I mean, that was one of the ways he was talked about upon his return. One, when he was in Scandinavia. Numerous critics are very adamant about, one, discussing him as a Black American artist, but then two, kind of talking about that in relationship to a certain primitivist aesthetic, and that takes hold again in the United States. And so I guess he kind of pulled it off. There's an interesting moment in in James Porter's Modern Negro Arts, and I mean, he's the one that catches Johnson on this. He calls Johnson out and says that he's playing a bit with these self-taught aesthetics. But one artist who does, slide by Porter is Jacob Lawrence, who, if you're looking in that book, you can only find him in the self-taught artists. So this is like it's an interesting terrain, specifically in this moment of the late 30s and 40s, and I think Johnson has critically some success in pulling off this primitivist aesthetic. One interest of note too, in terms of audience for these paintings, to my knowledge, there is none. These aren't shown. He shows his other Tunisian watercolors, but I can't find anything regarding them. And there's multiple studies of each one, so he has about 3 iterations of each of these paintings. That Johnson's history is kind of it's an interesting story in and of itself. But
James?
Of course, with Benga, the whole issue of audience in terms of, he's a dancer, he's performing within the music hall tradition and scene, and it's a popular art form. But then it's also interesting how these artists sort of use primitivism and use Féral Benga as this sort of icon of primitivism, and Benga himself using it to comment and to sort of put things in sort of modernist sort of languages, modernist ideas and concepts that really speak to the issue of agency and trying to subvert certain, that's part of, I guess, modernism, that idea of subversion and trying to épater le bourgeois, going against that. And people like Benga and Josephine Baker were doing that. They were complicit in primitivism and those aspects of it, but usually taking those things and turning it around to their advantage. Right? So, in that way, to me, they contribute very much so to this thing called modernism, or Afro-modernism, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I think in terms of the specific audience for these African dancer watercolors, I'm not sure that they were ever shown, but I think that Hayden was really most interested. His favorite audience was himself, and interested in amusing himself. You have to only flip through his sketchbooks to sort of see the humor that's there. But in terms of audience, I think really what these pictures are about, and I know it's somewhat problematic to say that these images that are clearly meant to be of Africans have little to do with Africans, but I think that Hayden was really more attuned to the idea that these dancers were being seen. He was attuned to the idea of the audience who was looking at them. And I think that even in his self-portrait, you get the sense of, even though it's a self-portrait, the idea of being seen, of having an audience, as opposed to necessarily making something for an audience. So I think that he's really interested in the dynamics of audience, and really interested in maybe, in a number of his works, playing with his audience in ways that they might not necessarily pick up on. He's sort of like, there's tons of double entendre right everywhere, or the idea that you can read this image two ways. And I think that's where his interest in audience lies.
We should have time for 2 more quick questions. Whoever has the mic right now.
Yeah.
Oh, someone in the back had the mic first, yeah. Go ahead. Oh, I can't see anything. Whoever has the mic goes now.
I think is there 2 mics or 1 mic?
There are 2, yeah.
I found today's presentation really fascinating because I'm kind of obsessed with modernism and how it relates to contemporary art, because I think that everything that's happened in the 20th and the 21st century is based on the African influence on European artists that happened with Primitivism. So I think that what Mia said was really fascinating when she said blacks performing blackness for whites, because I think that that's actually something that continues to this day. And I think also that I want to ask the question, if you think that Palmer Hayden's work could be compared to David Hammond's in terms of the kind of irony that Hammond's work has, in terms of the undertone and the playfulness and I guess, critique of society's response to black artists of their time.
Yeah, certainly. I think that both artists have a sense of humor, and a sense of irony about their own artistic practice. I think with Hayden, with Hammond's, clearly his sort of degree of success gives that, which Hayden didn't really have as much of in his own day, though he was recognized, makes sort of the irony and the cutting sort of humor in his work a little bit more recognized and easily legible than it first appears in Palmer Hayden's work. But I think both artists approach their position as black artists with a sense of humor and a sense of irony that informs their artistic production.
And 1 more question on the far left.
Yeah. I'm an aesthetic surgeon, and I noticed a couple comments that played out earlier, and I wanted to hear if your comments on them. And that was this idea of the Black American being somewhat separate from this idea of the diaspora. And the thought came up with both of the presentations with this panel related to Palmer Hayden with this comment that we're a brand new race, raised and born in the U.S., and then also the comment related to the comparison of Féral, of Vega and Josephine Baker with this idea of authenticity versus inauthenticity. And I see that it's an ongoing dilemma, I think, for African Americans as it relates to their conversation with the diaspora and its relationship to Africa. So I would like to hear your comments on that idea of the Black American artist or the Black American scholar, and how you navigate this sort of representational space in your relationship with this idea of authenticity as a part of the diaspora.
Don't look at me.
I'll take that one. Well, I think for for Hayden, certainly the differences between Black Americans or the differences between the way that the French treated Black Americans and treated their own colonial subjects who were also Black was pronounced. I believe Hayden took to walking around carrying an American or an English language newspaper under his arm so people would know, hey, I'm not actually one of your subjects, you can treat me well. But in terms of, but I think that if you even look at the statement that he made, we're a brand new race raised and manufactured in the US, that Hayden is, again, approaching it with a sense of humor and irony. He recognizes that there is a connection to Africa, but in the use of the verb manufactured also is thinking about the constructedness of African American identity. And, I think his lack of interest in painting about Africa had a lot to do with understanding the mediated mechanisms in which African Americans were coming back to African art. And so seeing himself as part of a larger diaspora was something that he could recognize sort of intellectually, but culturally wanted to also understand or in some way mark those differences. And I think that it's a complicated subject with all of these sort of the artists of this period because they are, at once trying to be part of a larger African diaspora, but having to confront that from a position of being Americans, right? So, it's a complicated tension there that, someone certainly like Count Cullen was exploring in his poem.
Thank you all so much, and thank you, Tanya, for filling in. And we'll welcome you all back here tomorrow at 10. There's a wedding going on downstairs, so we need to exit right away. At the base of the elevators, you'll be escorted out by a guard. So thank you all so much for coming.